Morning, everyone. So thank you, glad to be here to part of this presentation I've put together today. We'll be looking at more of the moving parts, the process and the approach at road building in Northern Ontario. So yes, I'm Scott Peterson with TBT Engineering. We have strengths for sure in transportation engineering, environmental studies, and yeah, sort of look forward to working through the process and how we look at bringing access to communities or if it's resource driven. All right, so process and approach, road building, Northwestern Ontario. I'll kind of go through, like I said, sort of, it'll start off with the justification, lead into route planning, design elements. So really it'll take the what's needed, where it can go, where we can best fit this, and how we can accomplish it, how we can do it, and then the stage in sort of getting it done. Because for each of these, we want to be having a sensitive design, looking at the values, the conditions, because this is an important step when planning for a route, is identifying the needs. So it might be safety-driven, access limitations, if it's, maybe there's winter road problems or limited opportunities there. There could be commercial partnerships and drivers at the reason for a piece of infrastructure or bringing a road up into the communities or wherever it might be. And often resource or industry is a partner in this and can be a driver as well. And from our experience, we find that all three are usually sort of stitched or sewn together into this, and all will best benefit if that's the collaborative approach working together to get the justification correct. So we know what the infrastructure will look like, and we know what our target is, our objectives. So I think it's important when looking at justification to know what our demands are, what our needs are currently, and looking down the road at the future. Are there, maybe it's all-weather roads, it could be winter roads or enhanced winter roads that maybe go from a snowpack to an ice-packed surface, or like others have shared in the workshop here today, it was realigning those winter roads into higher ground to get to more useful life out of them and connect these communities and bring everybody together, because roads are sort of the link that connect our people and our communities. So sustainability, I guess a good design is a sustainable design. And it's important that when we're evaluating needs for planning, that there's a balance to the approach. And we need to look at long-term social, environmental, and economic objectives. And one thing that sometimes has been overlooked and needs to be a focus is our interaction with the environment. And sort of the people, planet, and profit, going back to that original triangle with justification. If we're going to do it, let's do it right and get it organized from the get-go. So that would identify the what or the need is required. And then as we step into sort of the route planning phase, which is of course, a critical component to any type of infrastructure, and surely for roads and complicated terrain. It's a cornerstone for really the success of all the following steps: the preliminary design, the detailed design, construction, of course, and the sustainability of that piece of infrastructure. So again, early identification of environmental values is critical. Land values, human values. We need to look at what potential there is for aggregate, what water crossings are out there, what needs to be avoided, protected. Because when you're traversing complicated terrain, we certainly don't want to be going in blind. We need to have some vision. And I think working together as a group, there's obviously a lot of knowledge and strengths in the north. And I think we can get it done, but there needs to be forethought. Because in Northern Ontario, we do have certainly the good fortune of having lots of water. So when stringing, whether it's sort of a network of infrastructure or individual links to communities, there will be water crossings, and they can be done well when there's careful planning in place, respect for the environmental values, and get the right mitigation measures or avoidance where possible. Again, there's a number of examples for crossing water, whether it's a steel modular bridge or it's culverts. But I think in any of them, when in the planning phase, priority should be looking at avoiding them and identifying them early on so that proper mitigation and environmental considerations are in place, because when poor planning takes hold, sometimes issues lie ahead, of course. Another thing that we have a lot of in Northern Ontario, where there's not water, there's generally swamp. And I'm sure, as you all know, that roads can be built across or through swamps. Without careful foresight and planning, surprises do arise and can be problematic for all parties involved. Generally, when crossing swamps, we want to limit the length of road that is going to be interacting with that piece of terrain. There's different approaches. You can dig it all out through excavation or means of trying to displace the material by adding fill. Again, those are fairly invasive and expensive construction techniques. Also, there's opportunities to bridge or float that particular piece of terrain. We could look at using, there's geosediment products, corduroy constructions used a lot in the past, and maybe there's an opportunity that to be revisited for some of these northern routes. Now, where there's not water or swamp, there's generally rock, which can be complicated, expensive to traverse. Now, rock can be certainly a benefit to any road infrastructure project because we can use it as a borrow or rock supply for the job. Bringing in aggregate to any length can be expensive and complicated if there's access limitations already. So avoidance, again, in route planning, looking at bedrock terrain, we want to steer maybe near it, but not necessarily across it. And of course, there's sensitivities associated with rock, land values, and human values that need to be incorporated into this planning study to identify these conditions early on. Now, sort of a natural lead-in from looking at terrain and bedrock, it's important that we know the terrain. And what I'm hearing a lot of the communities and what experience we have is find the geological maps, look at the topographical information available, and let that steer a lot of your routes where it makes sense. That'll get us up high and dry out of swampy or low-lying terrain areas, and provide access to very valuable aggregate resources. Developing aggregates along these road networks will be a critical, I think, component to the success of it, at least keep the costs manageable. Planned, environmentally conscious aggregate extraction makes a lot of sense, and it can be done well, it can be done poorly, and we've seen many examples of that, of course. This cartoon does sort of show a nice little gravel pit where it's got some reasonable buffers off of lakes or swampland, areas that have been reclaimed, which is nice to see, an active pit site, and some planning for the next phase for mining. So this sort of thing makes sense. And when planning routes, it's very important to take into consideration what you have for geology. We can't just let the engineering run everything. So that sort of marks the where, if you will. We've identified the what, could be coming out of the justification component, the where, based on the route planning, and the how would line up more with the design element of this process. So you'd line up starting normally in a preliminary design stage, and the successful preliminary design would establish a well-defined scope for the detailed design component, which would follow. It would have a good understanding of the environmental, human, and land values, and ultimately, it'll recommend one alignment for future phases. So through this, there's a lot of consultation and input required for all the stakeholders to make sure we get it right. And As you get down the rabbit hole, it gets a little bit more boring into engineering, because now the magic's not really there. The opportunities, hopefully highlighted through route planning. We've identified what type of infrastructure we need. Now it's just a matter of getting it done. So a detailed design normally would bring it in from how we're going to do it to getting it into a phase to get it completed. This would incorporate all elements of the design, so the environmental mitigation measures. It would look at roadside safety requirements. This would be looking at aggregate sources and being quite specific and having testing to make sure that we have the right type of product available for the roads and the needs. It would provide clear and concise recommendations, and also ultimately you'll end up with design drawings, contracts, technical specifications that the parties involved can rely on under the construction phase to make sure we get a solid partnership moving forward into what can be a successful project. So moving into construction, so tendering a contract and selecting the right contractor can certainly be stressful in any job, especially if you're looking at large value roadway networks, infrastructure with environmental components, and if there's a number of communities and stakeholders. We want to make sure that the interests of the partners are protected and the budgets are managed, so things get done right the first time and on schedule ideally. And it should be viewed as a partnership, which should be founded on integrity, respect, and trust. And then the strengths of that partnership would be relied on with the details if it's a solid contract for resolving if there's confusions or issues that do arise. Because I think it's in everybody's interest to get the job done right and on time if possible. So as you work through the construction bit, ultimately following capital infrastructure costs, you'll end up with operations. So it comes back to, was the infrastructure, was the what correct? Did we have the right type of infrastructure identified? Were the needs, and was there enough foresight? Was the preliminary design, the detailed design accurate to ensure that the operation and the cost to maintain that infrastructure is manageable? Because when it's not, it can be damaging and quite staggering if there's maybe there's shortfalls in the construction or design resulting in washouts. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But if there's undersizing of culverts or storm events aren't calculated properly, somebody just went crazy with the crack sealant there. That's just an example of goofiness. But again, there's a lot of complicated terrain in Northern Ontario. It's definitely expensive to build across, but it is certainly more expensive to fix after the fact. So what I've done is I've put together a few sample projects that sort of highlight how, going through justification, detailed design, construction, some projects that we've worked on recently across Northern Ontario. One happens to be in Nunavut. And it sort of highlights how these phases were brought into, oh, right. It's true. So a sample project not too far down the road that needed some a new roadway was the portion of Highway 600 associated with the New Gold project. And as you can see, this is just a cartoon, but there is a large hole in the ground, and that was the justification for the relocation of about 11.5 kilometers of provincial highway. So we were involved working with the proponent, the owner, municipalities, and government agencies, really for the design, ultimately the design and overseeing the construction of that. So in that particular one, there was 8 alignments identified. They were all reviewed. The one ultimately selected, to be honest, was not the best alignment from an engineering perspective, but it comes back to a balance. You have to look at all facets and all the moving parts And it turned out the one that was selected, was rated the best because it had the least property impact and had better environmental conditions than some of the other selections. Typical road, nothing exciting. It's a gravel surface road, 2 lanes, which would be very, very common, and we'll see a lot of that across Northern Ontario, of course. Also, there was opportunity to provide power within the corridor, so it was used sort of a multi-function right-of-way or road allowance. And there was 1 water crossing on that particular one. Again, taking the basic principles of route planning, trying to limit the amount of water to be crossed, obviously due to potential environmental impacts and the cost associated with that. So this is the crossing of the Pinewood River, and landed up ultimately putting in a 2-lane steel modular bridge, which was founded on piles because we had, I think, close to 20 to 30 meters of clay, so shallow foundations were not an option. You can see there's a couple of straw bales. There's erosion protection and environmental setbacks to mitigate what was sort of a nice natural feature there, of course. But this project, so this went through starting in 2012, and construction opened in 2015, just for a rough idea on time frame. And that brought in all of the phases previously discussed. Another project, again, not too far from where Rainy River was, but the Matangi-Kaming First Nation access road is 24 kilometers of gravel road that had many unfavorable vertical and horizontal curves. The water crossings were fairly simple, largely just culverts. And the justification was for improving safety for access, because too many of the curves were too sharp for the school buses to make those corners, or there wasn't enough snow storage on the facility. So TBT, we got involved in helping with route planning early on, and I must say this was a very cool project because we had the help from one of the community elders who knew the grounds, knew the values, and ultimately knew the best routes. So we were provided sketches. We were able to spend a day or two walking about and looking at these alignments. And again, a lot of time went into planning, because when we're spending dollars that are hard to come by, we want to make sure that every dollar counts and we get the right alignment so we get the best out of our safety for the community and for potential commercial growth opportunities. I think was part of the driver here as well. On this access road, again, it was sort of remote in respect to what locally was available for aggregate. So we worked with the community, did a feasibility study looking at 28 potential quarry sites or borrow areas. Ultimately, it was narrowed down to 1, which made sense geographically and considering the environmental values. So this is a win for the community. They were able to go through the studies, the permitting process, establish a quarry site, which then turned around and ultimately fed aggregates to the project that followed. And then it also allowed opportunities for the community for commercial partnerships elsewhere in the area, because they did have a high quality quarry source now that they could feed for future maintenance on this, or local roads boards, or what have you. The third one's a little bit further away. This is a job, unfortunately, I never did get my boots on the ground there. Rob Furnett spent some time in a helicopter and reviewing alignments, and came up with what was, I believe, ultimately the selected alignment for the all-weather road, which was 54 kilometers running from High Lake Mine up to Grays Bay Port. And the idea is to get ore out to the port at Coronation Bay. So again, this just sort of highlighting justifications. This would be an example of sort of resource-driven infrastructure. Road planning, the first step was jump on a helicopter, and they flew all the alignments, and because the terrain is quite complicated. Similar to here, just, well, I guess polar bears and no trees, so not all that similar. But again, so high level, the 30,000 foot level down through reconnaissance, boots on the ground looking at water crossings, picking up topographical details, which then fed into the preliminary design for, I guess, the identification of alignments, and then revising those based on the environmental features and values that were identified through that planning stage. Ultimately, I think there were 6 bridges required, 8 culverts, so over 54 kilometers of road. That's pretty good. Again, most of the crossings would have been steel modular bridges that could have been easily transported to the site and launched without much in place, curing of concrete, these sort of things. So yeah, that was an interesting project. I wish I had more time to get up there. And at Gray's Bay itself,
the Arctic Ocean is cold.
So we expected to see him a little bit deeper, but he only got up to his ankles. But that's, in a nutshell, sort of the moving parts to, I guess, road building, or at least the approach to looking at designing and implementing a detailed design contract for building any type of road in Northern Ontario. Maybe I could open the floor if there's any questions.
I guess my question is that regarding the construction of bridges and the crossings in the north, what kind of crossing would you recommend for that we have up there?
For which crossing?
You know, like the rivers and all that, is it going to be like a gravel crossing or construction? Certain areas, I'm just looking at the types of design of the bridges. Like I look at the washout, like the roads and stuff like that, eh?
Mm-hmm.
And and the questions that we talk about engineering a road, especially if there's even roads going through Muskie and Tundra. What are your comments regarding road design in those kind of areas?
So for water crossings, there's a number of options depending on, I guess, the floodplain and the feature itself. So ideally, when approaching a river or stream, we want to hit it, I guess, as at the thinnest, where the shoreline's most defined. So we want to avoid sort of those longer reaches where the floodplains, and when some seasons in the spring or the fall. I'm just going to reset this. It seemed to work last time. So culverts, there's open-footed culverts, open bottom. I'm just going to turn that off. Open bottom culverts are a good approach. They can be hauled in, lift them in with an excavator. There can be concrete footings poured, or even use steel footings at the underside of the culvert. Again, that washout picture, we want to make sure that the hydrology and the drainage is properly captured, so the size is right, because we don't want to be going back up, losing access because of a washout cutting off that particular piece of infrastructure. The steel modular bridges seem to have an excellent fit in Northern Ontario. The price point, I think, is good, and they are sort of easy to put in place, depending on the span. I think they can span upwards of 40 meters, 50.
Maybe they can do over 100.
Up to 100.
Single span?
Yes.
Single span. Yeah.
Single span.
Some of the major bridges. Wow. I talked to Del Gaston at NOFNEC last week, and he said they're even trying to push one to 120. Now they've got stack panels.
Yep.
But 120 meters, somewhere in that 300-400 feet would be about the maximum without piers.
That's a substantial crossing.
Yes.
Yep.
Generally about 80 at this point in time.
And that'd be launched with, you need a crane to get that out, both sides.
For a launching nose or a
Yeah.
barge. Yeah. So generally 80 is a good maximum, but if you need to go more than that, there's a possibility to go up to 120.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ideally,
Or looking at piers.
If you can come down to a single lane, it'll cut your cost down considerably. But if you need the 2 lanes, then the engineering just gets a little more complicated, and the costs go up.
You guys also work with winter roads?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're doing a study right now for upgrading winter road network. And again, everybody's familiar with the impacts of climate change and how it's limiting the effectiveness of the winter road system. So we're going through and then we've done a preliminary design on it, a preliminary study, assessment, with some recommendations being provided to improve the effectiveness of the winter road. I think everybody respects the fact that an all-weather road ultimately will be the best solution. But in the short term, for this year and next year, and even the next 5 years, well, these issues and decisions get sorted out, some improvements to the winter road systems could certainly benefit the community. Even when the all-weather roads go into construction, a reliance on the winter road network will be necessary just to get equipment and supplies and set up camps for the construction of the all-weather roads.
Yeah, and I think on that one, we were looking at a scenario, bringing it up to meet a current standard, bringing it up to an ice cap standard, sort of engineering ice road, and then looking at bringing in smaller structures to cross problematic water crossing, that send to, they thaw out, or there's a little bit of current so you don't ever can build enough ice. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to know, can you give us an idea of how much it costs to on a gravel surface road per kilometer? Roughly?
Well, depending on access to your aggregate supply and what's available for construction camps, you could be anywhere from 500 to 700,000 a kilometer.
Depends on the standard too. If you're going with a resource standard road or a community access standard road, it will be on the lower end. As Phil was suggesting, if a northern highway system were ever developed to go to the NPO standard, you're probably $1 million a kilometer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Depending on the water crossings.
But the advantage of that higher standard is that you will have less situations where washouts or flooding or some road closures or limitations, half loads. That's right.
And then you can build up your businesses.
Yes, and then
Economic development.
for sure, there's benefits, significant benefits to all involved in that infrastructure.
It's a lot of money, but there's also lots of opportunities for the communities themselves. And again, Scott highlighted the Matanjaming project, and we've been very, very fortunate in having the cooperation and the assistance of community members, both with the development of a commercial quarry and also working on the road project itself. Some with the contractors, some with us providing the engineering contract administration. Now, the nature of construction is projects come, they go. One gentleman that we hired to work with us on last year's construction project moved on. He's now working with us at Newville. The project going there. So it's long-term employment opportunities for community members.
If there's no further questions, I'll turn it over for lunch, or what follows.
I think lunch wins. Thanks, Scott. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you very much.